Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to another edition of Money Matters Monday, a podcast series that we are presenting to help our staff and our community members and stakeholders just help understand the complexity of school finance in the state of Washington. I want to remind our viewers that if at any time you have a question, uh, please, we want you to email us at the email address listed below, and we might be reading your question on air with a response. So that will be posted throughout our podcast. I'm joined again today by our Director of Finance and Operations, Marshall Cruz. And so I just want to say first, welcome, Happy New Year, Marshall.
Good morning, Josh. Nice snowy morning here in Granite Falls.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. So, Marshall, we had our first podcast in December, our first one, Money Matters Monday, and we talked about the different funds. Um, yeah, I think the first point I made was, or the first question I had to help our viewers understand school finances. When we talk about a school budget, we're not talking about one budget. It's actually multiple budgets or funds or buckets, as sometimes we use a euphemism for that. Um, can you just give us like a 45-second summation of those funds again before we get into our topic of the general fund today?
Sure. And we had a bit of a deeper dive in our last podcast, but we have the general fund, which the bulk of our day-to-day operations are go in and out of the general fund. It's about $40 million annually. We have capital projects fund, which is about $750,000 a year. And that is for small capital projects and technology purchases. We have debt services, which is about $5 million a year. And that debt services fund can only be spent to pay the interest and principal of voter um, issued debt, like bonds. We have ASB, Associate Student Body, which is money raised and spent by the students that we just hold on to. They have to approve all the activities going in and out of that fund. And then we have Transportation Vehicle Fund, which can only be used to purchase new buses. Can't be used to pay for drivers, to repair buses, to buy new tires. It can only be used to purchase brand new buses.
And I think this is really important to just emphasize one more time that we have multiple funds, but there's a strict prescription by law on how we spend those funds.
Absolutely. We operate, there's OSPI has what's called the school accounting manual that's published on their website. It's, geez, I think it's gotten up to about 900 pages long, but it prescribes in great detail what we can and cannot do with all of these funds. And there are, aside from the general fund, there are pretty strict limitations on the other funds. The general fund you can spend on pretty much anything that you deem necessary. But the four other funds that we use have really strict restrictions.
And one thing that's uh, is a good reminder for our viewers is we do have an audit every year as well. So there is a checks and balance in the whole school finance process, and so every year we have state auditors come and they spend really weeks, if not months.
Right. It usually takes anywhere from a month to 2.5 months, depending upon, there's different cycles of what they audit every year. So on a down cycle year, it'll maybe take a month and a half. And on an upcycle year, it could take up to 2 or 3 months to audit. And they always audit our financials. They always audit at least two federal programs, and a federal program would be like Title I or child nutrition or special ed. And then on the every other year, they can do a deep dive into whatever they want to look at, and often that is statewide trends that they decide to look at or suggestions from their office. And as they're auditing our stuff, if they see things they want to look into a little deeper, they will.
Okay. Thank you. That's a good summation of both those funds, as well as to tell our viewers that there are, again, checks and balances and audits that occur on an annual basis. So let's get to today's topic. And that's the general fund. And so this is the majority of our funds that we receive from the state. Tell us a little bit about the general fund.
Right. So the general fund is where we do the bulk of our spending. We receive about $40 million a year into the general fund. And that's somewhere around 88% of all of our revenue that we get goes into the general fund. There are things that we spend the general fund on. All of our salaries and benefits for bus drivers, teachers, paraprofessionals, nurses, all of those come out of the general fund. Fuel and utilities, our electric bill, our phone bill, the fuel for the buses, all of that comes out of the general fund. The cost to transport students from point A to point B, which is almost $2 million a year, that comes out of the general fund. Sports and extracurricular activities such as FBLA or basketball or all of those things come out of the general fund. And then all of our supplies and training come out of the general fund. And then any other services we provide for students all comes out of the general fund.
So the general fund is really, our goal is to educate students. And to do that, of course, we need excellent teachers. So we're paying salaries and benefits for that. We have a lot of support staff. We have administrators on top of just the utilities of our facilities, on and on and on. It really is the day-to-day operations of a school.
Absolutely.
So you just described a lot of the, I guess, the expenditure side of the general fund. Let's talk about the revenue side. So where do the funds from the general fund come from?
So the bulk of our money comes from the state. And I think there's maybe a misconception that all of our money comes from the state or the state pays for everything, but the state pays for about 79% of our operating costs. And that's really through this system called state apportionment. So we're going to dive deeper into state apportionment in a future podcast, but just in a 5-second summary, it's enrollment driven. The amount of enrollment you have generates the number of staff that you have, and the number of staff you have generates a dollar amount that the state gives you to pay for all that stuff. You can choose to have more or less staff than what the state pays you for. You can choose to pay your staff more or less than what the state pays you. But the state has this same, it's called the prototypical school model. They use the same model for all school districts in the state of Washington. And that's about 79% of our revenue. About 6% comes from federal funds, and those are in the form of grants that we go out for. And then about 15% is what the state refers to as local funds. And local funds are the levy that we do for renew every 4 years, any student fees that we collect, and then we have some partnerships with the county to provide some services that they kind of pass through the funding for that to us, and we pay the staff. So that's about 15% of our revenue.
Okay. My next question, we've sort of hit on this a little bit, but I think it's important to talk about it once more, especially within even the funds that we receive for the general fund. There are some restrictions. So let's talk about how those funds are used, and almost as importantly, what those funds cannot be used for. Whether it's, well, go ahead and jump in.
Right. There are a lot of restrictions within the general fund. Some of those are, we have CTE classes, and those CTE classes generate revenue. That CTE revenue needs to be spent on CTE activities. So to pay CTE teachers, to pay CTE supplies, to pay CTE benefits.
And before you go forward, let's just define CTE. That's Career and Technical Education. And so we have a number of classes at the middle school and high school that are career and technical. So culinary arts would be an example. We have a very active and large agricultural program. Go ahead.
Right. Um, we also have a lot of grants that come into our general fund, and when we apply for a grant, we have to upfront tell the person issuing the grant how we're going to use the grant money, and then we have to track that very directly to the grant and report out on it at the end of the year that we spent the money as we said we were going to spend it. We only spent it on grant eligible activities, and we have probably 10 to 15 grants every year in the state area that we're kind of managing and making sure that we're spending it the way it's supposed to be spent. We also have special education. So special education students generate their own bucket of revenue within the general fund, and that has to be spent on special education. And there are a lot of even more advanced restrictions on that we can't spend less per student this year than we did last year. We can't spend more out of one bucket than the other than we did last year. There's a lot of really detailed restrictions on special ed. There's also, we have the state of Washington a couple of years ago issued a K-3 class size reduction initiative where we have to average 17 to 1 in our kindergarten to third grade band. So 17 students to every one teacher we have that teaches in K-3. If we are higher than that, like if we have one teacher for every 18 students, they give us less money. So we want to be at the 17 to 1 because that's how we receive the maximum amount of money that the state will give us.
So what you just shared, I want to highlight another point on that checks and balances, because not only when it comes to those restrictions, are we reporting to one internally, so within our offices of how schools are using it, make sure it's used properly. But then there's a lot of state reporting, and then I want to say again, we have state auditors, so as well as our board of directors. So we have a number of layers to ensure that the funds we receive in a certain budget are used appropriately.
Absolutely, there are multiple layers of mandatory checks and balances within the school accounting system. And just before we move on to another topic, there is one other huge restriction that I should mention, that the local revenue we receive, the money from our taxpayer levy, the student fees we take in, any little fees we get for selling like snacks at lunchtime, and the money we receive from Snohomish County that we pass through to employees, all that has to be spent on enhancement activities, for activities that go above and beyond what the prototypical school model gives us money for. So activities like that can be sports and extracurricular, because that's not part of the prototypical school model. Paying our teachers more than $66,000 a year, having more para-educators than the 3 that the prototypical school model allocates us, having more nurses than what the state model gives us. The state model maybe gives us enough for 1 nurse. We have 4. All of those things, which we'll dig in deeper later, but we have to balance that local revenue that we're receiving to these enhancement activities also, and report out on that separately to the auditors and to the state.
I really can't wait for our podcast on the prototypical state funding model, because I think it's going to be a real eye-opener as to what we are funded for, yet what doesn't get funded, that we need to ask our local taxpayers to help. And they are just some really basic needs. And I know that's one of the big arguments of, we need to revisit this, because the state truly isn't fully funding a quality education.
Absolutely.
So we really do rely on our local taxpayers quite a bit for, again, just some of those basic services. But that's for another podcast. Let's keep talking about the general fund. And the next topic I want to talk about is one we have been talking about for years. I think every year I've been here, we've been talking about the fund balance. And I liken the fund balance to a savings account I'll just give a personal story real fast, and then I'll let you jump in on fund balance topic on this topic. Is at my house over the winter break, our our heat system went out, and we ended up having to replace that. And the fund balance or our savings account was there to help put in a new one. And so um, when we talk about a fund balance that's in a school district, we're talking about somewhat of an equivalent of a savings account. Tell us a little bit about the fund balance in a school district.
Yeah, the fund balance. So school districts operate. We have to plan for an entire year. 4 months before that year begins, we issue contracts to employees that are guarantees of employment, and then we go through the year. And if we have surprises or enrollment isn't what we thought it would be, or some emergency happens, we can't ask the state for more money. We can't raise our prices. Our education is free to our customers. All we can do is dip into our fund balance. So it's important. And Granite Falls, before you got here, before I got here, before the previous superintendent got here, has always had a relatively low fund balance. It's difficult for small school districts to build a fund balance. We have all the same requirements and expenditures that big school districts have, and we don't have the enrollment to help offset some of those costs. So we've always struggled with fund balance here. And one of the big reasons why a savings account or a fund balance is important for us is because our expenses are linear, meaning that they're pretty much the same every month because we pay everybody over a 12-month period of time, equal amounts every month. And employee costs are 90% of what our expenditures are. So our expenditures are linear, but the revenue the state gives us is a roller coaster, and it's very backloaded so that we get 26% of our total revenue in the last 2 months of the school district and the last 2 months of the year. So if we don't have a little bit of a cushion, we end up not having positive cash flow in months in the middle of the year. And that becomes troublesome because, we need to have a healthy fund balance to maintain positive cash flow.
Marshall, you mentioned something about our percentage of salaries and benefits. There are two school finance rules of thumb that I think are pretty universal in public education in the United States. And the first one has to do with that fund balance. I mean, again, pretty universally in our country, 5% seems to be the rule of thumb.
Absolutely. And Granite Falls has, in your life here, in my life here, which is a little longer than your life here, and I think at least in the last superintendent's life here, we've never been at 5%. We made it to 3%, I think, once. I think a year and a half ago, we got up to almost 3.5%, closer to 4%. But we tend to fluctuate between 1.5% and 3.5%. And that's, it's a little difficult for small school districts to build a decent fund balance just because of all the pressures we have to employee costs. We typically have smaller school districts have a higher percentage of employee costs than bigger school districts.
However, it should be noted that we're one district that has always struggled with that. Even our like-sized districts in the state have
Right.
5% or higher. And so
Right.
I know we're working really hard this year to obtain and reach that 5%. The second rule of thumb has to do with the percentage that goes toward salaries and benefits. The general rule is if you can keep that to 85%, because this is, I mean, the service that we're providing is a quality education to students. And so we pay our staff to provide that service. So it's going to take up the majority of the budget. And so again, if you can hit that sweet spot of 85%, you have 15% to address all the other needs, including a reserve. We're closer to 90%. And
Right.
what are some of the things that we can do to address that, or that we are addressing?
I mean, it's difficult to address that. I think we'll talk about this more deeply in the prototypical school model, but there is tremendous inequities in how schools are funded in the state of Washington. And one of the things that Granite Falls has is we have a lot of needs in our district. We have a unique student population for sure. And we are funded at a lower rate than all of our surrounding school districts. So we have to be competitive in how we pay our teachers, or else we will lose them to all the surrounding school districts. Yet we get less funding than all of our surrounding school districts as well. So what we have to do is be creative in maybe not having as much money left over to pay for our maintenance and operations and utilities and extra stuff that other districts can purchase. We have to dedicate that to cost of staff.
We run a very lean operation.
Absolutely.
And I think that's indicative when we're getting to that 90%, which is not a comfortable position to be in. And just on a personal level, I think a lot of people can relate to that. When they have leaner years, it is a little bit tougher. And so us getting closer to that 85% is a great goal for our district to be working toward. Marshall, we've got some viewer questions. Again, we invite people to send their questions to the email that is on our podcast. But we have some viewer questions from our first podcast. And let me just read these to you. The first one, viewer writes, I just moved here from out of state. How are school construction projects funded in Washington?
Well, that's a painful question, Josh.
And it's one we'll probably address in another when we talk about bonds, but maybe what's a quick answer on this?
I guess I will say they're not. The school construction projects, like if small maintenance projects like putting in a new HVAC system or something like that, or even maybe buying a portable classroom, that can happen out of our capital projects fund. And that's realistic for schools to do out of what their operating costs are. But if we're having to build a new school, add a wing to a school, even put a roof on a school, that likely requires us to ask our local taxpayers to chip in even more money than they already do to pass a bond. And there are small buckets of opportunities for state matching funds. Like if you haven't done any improvements on your school in 25 years, you can get maybe 1/8 of the cost of what you're doing matched by the state. But otherwise, you're going out and asking your voters, asking them to buy a 60% plus one supermajority to approve them taxing themselves to pay for school improvements like that.
It is very complicated, and I'm not sure what state this person is coming from, but in state of Washington, the contribution from the state level is minimal. It's not. It really heavily relies on local contributions toward this. And we might invite this viewer to join. We've had a facility master plan committee for a number of years, and I know they're going to continue to do some work in the future. So if that individual would like to join that, please reach out.
And I will say there is some legislation to reduce the 60%, and there is some action by other school districts to try and convince the state that they should really be paying for a larger share of those construction projects.
Okay. Here's our second viewer. This is a great question. why do some schools this year, and actually it's not just this year, but the viewer is saying, why do some schools this year have free meals for students and some don't?
So this is a super complicated question and frustrating because I would advocate strongly that every student should be able to come to school and have a free meal as part of their education because there's so many studies that say students do so much better when they're fed at school. But beyond that, the reason why some of our schools have free meals and some don't is based on a free and reduced meal count that is done in October, where it's a survey. Some of it is direct certified from the state. Some of it is we send out a survey. We verify that if you are a certain percentage of the statewide poverty level and you qualify as free and reduced, and we get a percentage that generates a percentage at each school of who are free and reduced. The laws are slowly changing to have free meals in all schools. There's some legislation right now in the House that was introduced this last week that starting next year there'll be free meals across the board. But right now, you have to be at greater than 40% free and reduced or poverty number to get free meals. And there's some different, so and that has to be at the individual school. You could be at 30%, I believe, if you're in the K3 band of school. And so Monte Cristo is free because it is above that threshold, and it has a third grade class. Mountain Way is not free because it's below that threshold. Crossroads and Open Doors is free because it's at like 60% free and reduced. The high school and the middle school are much lower.
So my takeaway is, just to be clear to our viewers, this is not a Granite Falls School District decision that some schools get free meals and others don't. This is a state level decision based on schools qualifying for that benefit.
There's actually another layer of complication. It's a lot of our reimbursement comes from federal dollars for school meals. So there's a federal rule. The state chooses to supplement some of that federal rules so that we can have more students fed. And I think what the bill is in the legislature this year is that the state will come in and subsidize that remaining chunk of what the federal government doesn't pay so that all students can have free meals.
That was a great question by the viewer, and I'm hopeful that in the 25 or 24-25 school year that all of our schools would have that benefit for our students, because that really could be a game changer for our students that are our most needy students. So thank you for that update. Okay, we're to the end of this podcast, but before we go, I do want to remind our viewers, if you do have a finance question, to email us at mmm@gfalls.wednet.edu, and we get those questions, and we might be one of the ones that we present on our next podcast. So, Marshall, again, thank you. We look forward to seeing all of our viewers at our next podcast. We want to cover a number of topics, and maybe, Marshall, we'll just let's talk about those topics again. We want to talk about prototypical funding model for the state of Washington. We're going to talk about bonds and levies. We're going to do a deeper dive, maybe into some of our federal programs. And what else? What else do we want to cover?
Well, I think responding to suggestions from the viewers, I mean, there could be child nutrition sounds like something that they're interested in, and I think that's something we're all interested in.
That's right. That's right. So again, thank you, Marshall, and thank you to our viewers of our Money Matters Mondays, Money Matters Monday. And we look forward to having more time with you and answering your questions. Thanks again for joining.
All right. Thanks, Josh.